What a great assurance to know that He will hold us fast. I've titled this week's sermon, The A to Z of Suffering, the Desolate City, meaning the city of Jerusalem. And we're in this little book of Lamentations for 3 weeks. So we're going to have to get used to finding it, because it's one of those little books that I suspect move around when you close your Bible, and it hides between those two major prophets of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, which were both set roughly around the same time as Lamentations. And it's pretty much what it says on the tin, or in the title at least, Lamentations. It's 5 sad poems. It's all poetry, and it's pretty well all sad. It's pretty awful stuff. In fact, the grief and sorrow are overwhelming. In 587 BC, the city of Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. It was sacked, and almost all its inhabitants were either slaughtered or taken into exile. The poet reflects on that tragedy, so we begin in verse 1. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears are upon her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her, they've become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labour, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations, she finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. Poetry is a great medium for expressing sorrow and sadness, for pathos. I mean, think of Thomas Hardy, where he writes, if I have learnt one thing, it is the passing preciousness of dreams, that our aspects are within us, and who seems most kingly is indeed the king. And what about W.B. Yeats? For this kingdom is more full of weeping than you will ever know. Poetry is effective for expressing sorrow, and the nature of Hebrew poetry has a peculiar limping rhythm or metre known as a quina, in which at the end of each line it kind of dies away and expires, expressing a sadness. And the poems are highly structured. This isn't clear to us in the English, but most of the chapters are acrostics. That is, that the first letter of the first word of each verse works through the Hebrew alphabet. So think of that bit of doggerel. An Australian army, awful arrayed, boldly by battery besiege Belgrade. Cossack commanders courageously come, dealing destruction, devastating doom. A, B, C, D, as we go through them lines. Well, you'll get the idea. But hopefully the original Hebrew sounded a little bit better than that. There were 22 letters, or there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So 22 verses in each chapter of Lamentations, bar chapter 3, and we'll deal with that when we get there. In fact, with Psalm 119, which is also an acrostic, these 5 laments are some of the most elaborate compositions in the whole Bible. So on one hand, we have passionate emotion being poured out. So we have look at verse 1, verse 12. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see, is any suffering like my suffering that is inflicted on me, that the Lord brought on me in the day of his fierce anger? And on the other hand, we have highly structured, one might say almost artificially structured, poetic form. The acrostic form implies that nothing will be left out. It is, if you like, an A to Z of suffering, the whole gamut of pain. But it also sets limits. There's only 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, so we're going to get to the end. And if there's a beginning to suffering, then there's also an end to it, and that's good news for us, isn't it? Barry Rebb wrote, the mind of a person in deep sorrow characteristically tends to move in circles, returning again and again to the source of grief, unable to leave it and unable to resolve it. The acrostic allows grief to be fully expressed, yet at the same time sets limits to it. Sorrow and suffering are not infinite. Either the suffering ends or life perhaps ends, but there is an end to the suffering. Philosopher Seneca said, Fluent lacrimae sed idem et descent. That's easy for him to say, but that means let the tears flow, let them also cease. There's no question of not taking suffering seriously in Lamentations, but the poetic form also suggests an end to that suffering. Nor should we expect of poetry the logical clarity of prose. We need to read poetry and listen to it, let it move us rather than try to analyse its arguments. One preacher said of Lamentations, there was like a man setting up his easel beside the road to paint a beautiful oil painting of a car crash scene where his family have just been killed in a road traffic accident. I think that puts it quite well. And so our first point, or my first heading, is facing the reality of grief. Pain is the total environment of Lamentations, and each poem invites us to look pain squarely in the face. There's no avoiding it. There's no cover-up. There's no pretense. There's none of this stiff upper lip. People cope with calamity not by repressing grief and shock, but by facing and measuring its dimensions. And this suffering has a distinct historical setting. The poet is not just on some self-indulgent emotional trip, melancholy for its own sake. So let's read, in fact, 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 1 to 11, which sets it all into context. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th hour of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gates between the 2 walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled towards Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The old Babylonian army, under the command of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. So that narrative account provides the footnotes or background for almost every verse in Lamentations. We've got the siege, the famine, the flight of the king, the looting and burning of the temple, the demolition of the city walls, the slaughter of leaders, and the exile of the inhabitants. The grieving of the poems is rooted back into real history. As we know, the question, what actually happened, is as important as a question to ask in deep sorrow as, how do you feel? Because separated from its history, suffering swells up out of all proportion. So inevitably the poems have recurring themes triggered by their historical setting. There is reversal 3 times in the first verse. How deserted lies the city, once so full. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. And then there's the rejection and alienation. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears upon her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labour, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress, verses 2 and 3. And then we find there's death and destruction. In the days of her affliction and wandering, Jerusalem remembers all the treasures that were hers in the days of old. When her people fell into enemy hands, there was no one to help her. Her enemies looked at her and laughed at her destruction, verse 7. And then verse 20, see, O Lord, how distressed I am. I am in torment within, and in my heart I'm disturbed. For I have been most rebellious outside. The sword bereaves. Inside there is only death. And then we find defilement. Jerusalem has sinned greatly, and so has become unclean. All who honoured her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns away. Her filthiness clung to her skirts. She did not consider her future. Her fall was astounding. There was none to comfort her. Look, O Lord, on my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed, verses 8 and 9. And then we go back to verse 2, is found weeping. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears upon her cheek. And then verse 16, this is why I weep, and my eyes overflow with tears. Excuse me. No one is near to comfort me, no one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed. And then there's the spectacle, the invitation to look and consider such sorrow. Look, O Lord, on my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed, verse 9. Then verses 11 and 12. Look, O Lord, and consider, for I am despised. It is nothing to you, all you who pass by. Look around and see, is any suffering like my suffering? Then verse 18, listen, all you peoples, look upon my suffering. And verse 20, see, O Lord, how distressed I am. I'm in torment within, and my heart is, in my heart I am disturbed. These and other themes link all 5 poems together, and there's an even more sinister note which grows steadily more insistent through chapter 1, and you certainly can't miss it in chapter 2, because there's a theological reason behind this disaster, and Jerusalem's religion has no answer to it. Indeed, it's come to an end in the face of it. So chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, the roads to Zion, that was a term for Jerusalem as a great religious place, mourn, for no one comes to her appointed feast. All her gateways are desolate. Her priests groan, her maidens grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. Her foes have become her masters, her enemies are at ease. The Lord has brought her grief because of her sins. Verse 8, Jerusalem has sinned greatly, and so has become unclean. Verse 10, the enemy laid hands on all her treasures. She saw pagan nations enter her sanctuary, those who were forbidden to enter your assembly. And then again, verses 12 to 15, is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see, is any suffering like my suffering that was inflicted on me, that the Lord brought on me in the day of his fierce anger? From on high he sent fire, he sent it down into my bones. He spread a net for my feet and turned me back. He made me desolate, faint all the day long. My sins have been bound into a yoke by his hands. They were woven together, they've come upon my neck, and the Lord has sapped my strength. He has handed me over to those I cannot withstand. The Lord has rejected all the warriors in my midst. He has summoned an army against me to crush my young men. In his winepress, the Lord has trampled the virgin daughter of Judah. That's verses 12 to 15. And verse 18, the Lord is righteous, yet I rebelled against his command. In fact, as we get to chapter 2, God is the subject of every verb in the first 8 verses. So we read how the Lord has covered the daughter Zion with the cloud of his anger. He has hurled down the splendor of Israel from heaven to earth. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. Without the pity, the Lord has swallowed up all the dwellings of Jacob. In his wrath, he has torn down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought her kingdom and its princes down to the ground in dishonor. In fierce anger, he has cut off every horn of Israel. He has withdrawn his right hand at the approach of the enemy. He has burned in Jacob like a flaming fire that consumes everything around it. Like an enemy, he has strung his bow, his right hand is ready. Like a foe, he has slain all who were pleasing to the eye. He has poured out his wrath like fire on the tent of the daughter of Zion. The Lord is like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all her palaces and destroyed her strongholds. He has multiplied mourning and lamentation for the daughter of Judah. He has laid waste his dwelling like a garden. He has destroyed his place of meeting. The Lord has made Zion forget her appointed feasts and her Sabbaths. In his fierce anger, he has spurned both king and priest. The Lord has rejected his altar and abandoned his sanctuary. He has handed over to the enemy the walls of her palaces. They have raised a shout in the houses of the Lord, as on the day of an appointed feast. The Lord determined to tear down the wall around the daughter of Zion. He stretched out a measuring line and did not withhold his hand from destroying. He made ramparts and walls lament. Together they wasted away. That's chapter 2, verses 1 to 8. This is a lament, in effect, for the end of all what the Old Testament stood for. It brings us to our final point today, which I'm calling the bigger dimension. Lamentations never expresses a moment's doubt as to why the tragedy has come upon Israel. It was due to the people's sin, and it was what they really deserved. People have asked me if this coronavirus is a similar punishment from God. And my honest reply is, I don't really know. It could be, couldn't it? It could be God's punishment on a sinful nation. But what I do know is that God could take it away if he really wanted to. Now look at chapter 2, verse 17, which in many ways is the key verse. The Lord has done what he planned. He has fulfilled his word, which he decreed long ago. He has overthrown you without pity. He has let the enemy gloat over you. He has exalted the horn of your foes. Verse 17. You see, their religion had failed. So, verse 14, the visions of your prophets were false and worthless. They did not expose your sin to ward off your captivity. The oracles they gave you were false and misleading. But in all this, God's sovereignty is not in doubt. There's a lot more to say about this, and we'll be returning to it in coming weeks. So do please come back. This sermon series is very much a work in progress, but I want to leave you this week with an image that's helped me understand Lamentations and kind of helps me with this whole COVID thing and lockdown and everything else. However we view our lives, it's probably not as a fish, something like this. And I'm sorry the writing's back to front on your screens. But come with me for just a moment. You see, this little chap, this is you and me. And things are going, pardon the pun, swimmingly well. And then suddenly something comes along that overwhelms us. Lockdown, illness, in their situation, conquering armies. And so them things are what we call our circumstances. And so we're swallowed up by our circumstances. So you can see us there, we're the little green one, but our circumstances are all surrounding. They're eating us up. They're surrounding us in every single way. Remember what's said to us in chapter 1, verse 12? Is it nothing to you? All who pass by, look around and see, is any suffering like my suffering that was inflicted on me, that the Lord brought on me in the day of his fierce anger? This is why my eyes overflow with tears, and no one is near to comfort me, no one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed. Now, not many of us will have faced the suffering of 6th century BC Jerusalem, but some of us might do. And much of the world knows or has known similar suffering. Jerusalem's pain was not actually unique in its physical or emotional dimensions, but we all have different pain thresholds. None of us can judge one another when it comes to suffering. We've all had our taste of despair in the face of hostile circumstances. Verse 11, my eyes fail from weeping. I'm in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed, because children and infants faint in the streets of the city. Verse 11. There's many things within us that grieve us and bring us down. But Lamentations says to us, open your eyes. Don't just concentrate on the circumstances that surround you, because there's something so much bigger. We need to remember that. Open our eyes a little bit wider. See beyond our circumstances. The Lord has done what he planned. He's fulfilled his word, which he decreed long ago. He's overthrown you without pity. He has let the enemy gloat over you. He has exalted the horn of your foes. You see, there's us, the little green fish, and there's our circumstances surrounding us. But there's something far better, and that's our sovereign God. Our sovereign God, he does have teeth, and that, in one sense, that makes it far worse. We can't read Lamentations and avoid that. We see it, obviously, in the cross of Christ. God's sovereignty does have teeth, and he will be returning to that in sermons to come. But it's bigger beyond all measure than the circumstances of our lives. Yes, COVID is bad. Yes, the siege of Jerusalem was bad. But the creator of the universe is beyond our grasp, and he can more than cope with everything that defeats you and me. Whether that's things inside ourselves or external things which are outside ourselves. Bigger beyond all measure than the circumstances of our lives. No matter how consuming they may appear to us and how much larger than us they may seem. Verse 17, my eyes fail from weeping. I'm in torment within. My heart is poured out to the ground. Sorry, verse 11. And then verse 17. The Lord has done what he planned. He has fulfilled his word, which he decreed long ago. We can't control our circumstances. And yes, they can dominate us at times. But there's one who has them all under his control. And that's great news. That's great news. We will find Lamentations is going to teach us that, and so much more from weeks to come. Let's trust God. He's in this situation with us, and he's far bigger and better than our current circumstances. So what do we do at a time like this? We turn our eyes upon Jesus. And that'd be a great song to sing now. So let's just do that. Turn your eyes upon Jesus.